Okay, we're ready when you are.
Okay, at this time, I will call to order the special meeting of December 13th, 2021. Before we get started, I do want to make sure everyone, if there's take extra precautions. Tonight, we've had a few staff members at City Hall that have tested positive for COVID. So we want to make sure everybody is being as safe as possible. I've also received word that the Omicron variant is now in Santa Clara County, which means it is most likely here in San Benito County. Also, I've just heard the state will mandate mask indoors as of Wednesday of this week throughout the state of California for all of you. So this variant seems to be spreading around. Please take extra precautions tonight. Let's stay safe, and we're wishing our staff members well and heal quickly. With that, Mr. Burns, will you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance tonight?
Thank you, Mayor. I'd be pleased to. Ready, begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much, sir. If we can now move to roll call.
Councilmember Perez,
Present.
Vice Mayor Resendez,
Present.
Mayor Velasquez,
Here.
Councilmember Burns,
Here.
City Manager Miller,
Here.
City Attorney Epperson,
Here.
Police Chief Reynoso.
Here.
The agenda for the City of Hollister City Council special meeting of December 13, 2021 was posted on the bulletin board on December 3rd, 2021 at 4:22 p.m. per Government Code Section 54956.
Thank you very much. We will now move to item A1, the oath of office for Councilmember District 3. City Clerk, will you be taking care of that?
Yes, sorry. And then you can see here. And then this way everyone that's on Zoom can hear us. Mayor, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so go ahead and raise your right hand and just repeat after me. I state your name.
I, Dolores Morales,
Do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend
that I support and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies,
against all enemies,
foreign and domestic,
foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States
to the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies,
against all enemies,
foreign and domestic.
foreign and domestic.
I think I may have skipped a line. That I take this obligation freely
That I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
and that I will,
and that I will
well and faithfully,
and faithfully
discharge the duties
discharge the duties
upon which I'm about to enter.
upon which I'm about to enter.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. Did you want to take a moment to take pictures with your family or anything?
So if the camera can look at the audience, I don't know if it can, but I want to thank all of my friends and family for being here and driving as far as from Colorado to be here on this very special night with me. You are very special to me, and I look forward to working with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. We we are now going to move to item A2, the selection for the vice mayor. This year, the vice mayor will be Mr. Rick Perez.
I state your name,
I, Rick Perez,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies,
against all enemies,
foreign and domestic,
foreign and domestic.
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States
to the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California,
and the Constitution of the State of California,
that I take this obligation freely
that I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservations
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
and that I will,
and that I will,
well and faithfully,
well and faithfully,
discharge the duties
discharge the duties
upon which I am about to enter.
upon which I'm about to enter.
Great. Congratulations.
Congratulations, sir.
That we actually have the oaths for you to sign, so do you guys want to do that?
Nova, is everything taken care of now?
Yes.
Okay. This time, we're going to go ahead and move forward with item A3.
And Mr. Mayor, I'd like to introduce to everyone Jim Priest, although his Zoom name says William Priest, and he's been an attorney for over 20 years practicing in California, and his current focus, his current specialty is election law, which is obviously relevant to item number 3.
Excellent. Thank you for coming to join us on Zoom tonight, Mr. Priest. We're, as you know, we worked earlier in the year on some new rules on campaign finance, and we feel maybe there is adjustments that need to be needed. I'm sure we have questions from the council. Maybe we can start with any questions from the council or comments. Are there any?
Mayor Velazquez, Tim Burr.
Council members, if you can raise your hands up so I can kind of see. There you go. Mr. Burns, usually I can see you moving for the microphone, but from here I can't tonight. So that's great. You can raise your hand. Mr. Burns, go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Priest, I was curious, I've looked at the staff report and there's a reference to the penalties in the enforcement section. I believe it said, refer to section 2.05, I think it was. And I tried to find 2.05 and I went online and I could not find it on the city website. So I'm curious if you can speak to that and maybe give me some specifics if they're existing currently. Can't hear you, sir.
Sorry, I'll unmute myself. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council. First of all, it's an honor to be here this evening. To address Councilmember Burns' question specifically, I might refer that to Mr. Epperson. I did not draft that amendment. I think that may have come from the city attorney's office, and perhaps he can provide some clarification, because I agree with you. I did not see a chapter 2.05 in the current code either. I thought perhaps that was an amendment that the city was working on, but maybe Mr. Epperson can clarify that.
Yes, and I'm a little bit befuddled myself, Councilmember Burns. I'm not finding 2.05 here. I'll continue to look for it. It's either,
Jason?
excuse me?
I think what it is that we haven't amended the city code to add chapter 2.05. If we did draft an ordinance to add the campaign finance stuff, then that's where it would be added. But I don't think that's been done yet because they've talked about it, but nothing has happened yet.
Understood. So it sounds like that solves the mystery. It's put in there as a placeholder, it sounds like, for when it is passed or adopted, if and when.
Thank you. And I guess then the other question I have is, in reviewing the staff report, really it's pretty much as it was adopted, with the exception of the, I think there were blue strike-throughs. And so I didn't really see much really different from what I saw there. So until we have a section 205, there's really not much to discuss as far as I can tell at this point. Thank you, and that concludes my questions and comments.
And I would tend to agree with you. Until that's done, this was supposed to be an informational meeting, which Mr. Priest was here to discuss with all of you different options and what direction we want to go.
Correct. I think the point tonight was to ask questions of Mr. Priest, what can be done, what can't be done. So when we finish up this ordinance, we can do it correctly. So if you have any questions or suggestions, we can move on. Go ahead, Vice Mayor Perez.
Wow, that sounds kind of good. At least for a year. I just have one question. So as far as like enforcement of these rules and regulations, how is that going to be implemented? And if it's going to be our staff, are they qualified and trained for this purposes?
You're looking at me, obviously, Councilmember Perez. I think that's an extremely critical question, and Mr. Priest and I have discussed it extensively, and I'd actually prefer that he respond to that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Epperson, Councilmember Perez, honorable members of the council. Enforcement is a practical issue for the city of Hollister in this case, both with the campaign finance regulations as well as the council conduct policy, because as you have noted, under state law, you would be enforcing these yourself. I would note for the public that the city council adopted its own campaign contribution limit and disclosure requirements, which are different than the default limit under state law. And that's authorized by state law. But the flip side of that is that the state will not enforce a local campaign contribution limit that is different than the state's default limit, which is currently at $4,900 per source per election. So you are authorized to impose different campaign contribution limits. But again, the enforcement would be on the city. And that could be a challenge with staffing, infrastructure, those type of practical issues. I would also note quickly that enforcement of a council conduct policy is typically done through political means. And I did see references in your existing policy to removal from appointed committees and commissions, censure. Those are typically the sanctions imposed for violation of a council conduct policy. It is possible
that someone's conduct could get to the point where it may violate some other state law. Disclosing confidences that, under the Brown Act, there would be an independent violation there, which could obviously raise the sanction quite a bit. In some cases, some of these violations can be prosecuted criminally and civilly. But again, I think you have to take each situation on its own facts. Again, if it's an egregious situation, that would be something that perhaps could be looked at. But for the most part, when somebody is out of order, not perhaps conforming their norms exactly to the council conduct policy, again, typically removal from appointed committees is the most extreme it gets. It's a political solution as opposed to a strict legal solution.
And my only follow-up question is, what about an appeal process to that? Is there anything in there? Is it just a one-time sentence, so to speak, and that's it? Shouldn't there be an appeal process? I just see where a lot of this stuff is just unnecessarily written, where I might be not totally educated on all these processes. I'm still learning, but isn't there a state agency that enforces most of these rules, if not all of them?
As I mentioned previously, someone not conforming themselves to the council conduct policy could rise to such an extent that it may be an independent violation of state law, the example I was giving earlier, or perhaps if conduct was so disruptive to the meeting, it might actually be sanctionable under another state law. But again, if it's the more typical situation where perhaps someone is accused of not debating fairly, being out of order, something of that nature, the solution is political.
Thank you.
It is among the council, and the decision is with the council. It is a political solution to a political issue. It does not have the legality of, say, criminal, civil, fine sanctions. In those cases, there would be some due process issues, and we would have appeal process, things like that. But again, absent egregious conduct, that would be some independent violation of state law. Again, violation of a council conduct policy is typically politically dealt with, and then the appeal is to the council and it stays with the council. There's really no due process for a political decision beyond that.
Thank you. That's all.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Resendez.
Thank you. Really quick, just to point out, maybe Nova, this is for you, and to point out what Councilmember Burns had stated on page 17. 1, 2, 3, fourth paragraph down, it says, council members, the last paragraph says serious infractions of the code of ethics or code of conduct could lead to other sanctions. I just think that it might be good to define that in the new code because it's a little ambiguous. So just to take note of that, when we do define what those sanctions are, we can point out where they can be found. If it's in chapter 2.05 or whatever it is. My question for you, Mr. Priest, first of all, thanks for being here. I'm more interested in the campaign finance reform portion. What are some of the most basic means of, like with cities with ours, of monitoring that? Like, can we just have our city clerk say, this is an infraction and it's going to have a fine of this much, and then bring it to our attention? What do you think? What are some examples that you've seen in other cities, since you're more familiar with this, to not overcomplicate things?
Thank you, council member. I'll tell you, the first thing I have seen particularly small to medium-sized jurisdictions do to simplify the process is they adopt the default campaign contribution limit of $4,900 per source. And they often do that because then they can continue to glean the benefit of having FPPC enforcement of the contribution ordinance. Again, the city would have to make the policy decision whether it is worth the added administrative task of enforcement to have those lower contribution limits. And that's a policy discussion that city councils up and down the state have been having the last couple of years in implementing AB 571. To ultimate enforcement, you're right. I mean, the city clerk could, issue fines. The city could send a letter saying, you didn't disclose or you had a late filing. That can be done. However, ultimately, to enforce it, you're going to need to get a court order at the end of the day, or possibly some sort of an administrative fine process, but that could end up being appealed to court as well. And so the issue becomes not whether the city could just issue a fine. It would be a question of ultimately enforcing it and challenging, and that can get resource intensive. What I've seen some cities do is, again, they just go with the default contribution limit. They let the FPPC do the enforcement. Those that do local enforcement, it's a relatively new phenomenon we're seeing because of AB 571. They will appoint or authorize the city manager to hire an independent outside attorney who can investigate and, if necessary, file legal action to enforce fines, potentially criminal and civil injunctions, but that tends to be a little, but it definitely fines they can certainly enforce. But again, they'd have to go to court to do it if somebody decided that, no, I did not violate the ordinance, and it ends up becoming litigated. So there is that issue of, how many resources does the city place into enforcement of this?
Mr. Mayor, one more question if I can.
Right, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Priest, what about independent expenditures or PACs? How can we help to limit their influence on local elections?
I'm going to thank Mr. Eppers in advance because he prepared me for this question. Independent expenditure committees, also known as super PACs, are an interesting creature of election campaign finance law. Your ordinance or your resolution that we're talking about eventually turning into an ordinance limits direct campaign contributions to $250 per source per election. Those are direct contributions to either the candidate or to the candidate's controlled committee. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that cities and other local agencies have the authority to limit direct contributions, even though they are considered. But this one limitation on speech is okay to prevent actual or the appearance of pay-to-play corruption. And that's actually right out of the Supreme Court decision. So again, a city can limit direct contributions. And direct contributions mean those to the candidate or the candidate's controlled committee, and that's written that way in your ordinance. Independent expenditure committees, however, are not the candidate, and they are not the candidate's controlled committee. By definition, they are independent of the candidate. They do not take their direction from the candidate or the candidate's controlled committee. They are, outside of that sphere. Or hate it, the U.S. Supreme Court in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission 11 years ago ruled that independent expenditure committees are not subject to campaign contribution limits. So while your ordinance could continue to limit direct contributions to $250 per source per election, your ordinance may not constitutionally impose such a limit on an independent expenditure committee. They're called super PACs for a reason. This is their super authority under Citizens United, is that they can accept unlimited contributions and they can spend unlimited expenditures. And subject to reporting and disclosure, it cannot be subject to substantive limits. And so that is the issue with independent expenditure committees, is your ordinance cannot restrict their contributions in and expenditures out. The one exception would be if an independent expenditure committee were to make an actual direct contribution to the candidate. Then they're still subject to $250. But if they spend the rest of their money independently, just putting up their own signs, putting out their own social media without any direction or any connection to the candidate there, then they are independent and they're not subject to those limits. Very technical area of the law.
It does. Thank you so much. And then what would be like an infraction of that law? What would be one example of somebody crossing the line?
In an independent expenditure committee?
A candidate like communicating with independent expenditure committee or coordinating with them, would that be considered an infraction?
That would be a violation. Well, the way the state law is written is that an independent expenditure committee, by definition, is one that is not coordinating with the candidate. And coordination is a term of art we use in the law, meaning the candidate and the independent expenditure committee are talking and they're plotting strategy. On the other hand, if the committee is independent and they just support that candidate in and of themselves without receiving any directions from the candidate, then they may spend without limit to support that candidate.
Those conclude my questions. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Sir, I have several questions for you, and I do appreciate you being here tonight. I think we understood the issue with PACs early on, and I think we made that very clear that federal law does protect the PACs or super PACs, dark money, however you want to thing that's happening out there. But there are communities around the state that are pushing back in different ways. So I have a few questions for you. The conversation about enforcement, I think we all understood that could be a difficult thing if you're trying to issue penalties and other issues, other ways to penalize different groups. But let me ask you a couple of things. And without going to the point of FPPC, we talked about that's $4,900, the limit there. If we have a set limit, as we set the 250, other communities are doing this now, that could be enforced, probably not as far as, or probably could if you wanted to push it to the point of court, but it's more of a symbolism. It's, hey, look, here's our limits. If you're going to violate those limits, then we can issue a notice of violation. We can issue a notice of violation basically saying candidate X has violated the rules. That can be done at the city level, correct?
I don't see why not.
Okay, so it's a very simple, exceeded the contributions or did not report fully the contributions. Very simple to do.
Now, one thing I would be careful about, however, Mr. Mayor, is if you issue that notice of violation, you may have a candidate that wants some way to remedy or clear their name of that notice of violation, which means we would still have to provide some sort of appeal remedy, whether administrative or anything else, perhaps in court. I would be concerned about just publicizing because the city believes that perhaps the ordinance was violated.
Right.
So I'm sorry, maybe there's a caveat to that, and I should have said that earlier.
Yeah, no, that's administrative, but as we said earlier, that was part of the conversation. So there's a way to make sure it's correct. In this case, something like somebody accepts $300 instead of $250, that could be a notice of violation. Or
the question would then become, once the notice of violation is issued, does the city have the infrastructure in place to process an appeal if that candidate demands one?
right, and that would have to be worked out. I just want to know if things can be done, and then of course we'd have to set up a system for that. So this can be done, correct? The other things that I'm curious if we could do, if we did have a limit of $250, could it be said or written into our ordinance that the individual that did receive that amount of money could not vote on an item that would benefit that contributor for the term?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The answer to that would be no. It's an unusual idiosyncrasy in the law. The Political Reform Act does have restrictions that say if you receive more than $250 within a 12-month period from an applicant for a permit or some sort of other authorization from the city, you would have to recuse yourself. However, that only applies to appointed officials. So if you have planning commissioners, civil service board members, people like that, they may have to recuse themselves from a decision. That has happened from time to time. On the other hand, we have case law that says that a city council member's receipt of campaign contributions, the Breakstone Billiards decision and the all towing services versus Orange County case, say that the receipt of campaign contributions does not force a recusal. So it draws this very interesting distinction between a sitting appointed official and a sitting elected official. And so contributions do not force a recusal. And by logic, application of logic here, I don't think that taking an excessive campaign contribution would force a they just do not count in forcing a recusal. Again, there may be other remedies to address the excessive contribution, but not a recusal.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. How about in-kind contributions? Would that apply also?
In-kind contributions are treated like cash for the value of the in-kind contribution.
So if somebody were to get an in-kind contribution that has a value of over $250, if we had a limit at $250, that would, again...
Yes, it can be. Now, yes, it can be. Now, the is, how do you value an in-kind contribution? And I have seen FPPC opinions where that ends up getting litigated, and you actually end up having witnesses and sometimes experts saying, oh yeah, this was worth, $10,000 of service or $10,000 of value, because, a state case, you're dealing with, higher margins of numbers there. You would have the same factual issue you'd have to resolve if you were enforcing one of these, is how much was the value of that in-kind contribution? Did it exceed $250 or not?
Perfect, thank you. So I'm going to move on to the PAC issue. It's a little more interesting there. You mentioned earlier that basically PACs can do pretty much what they want as long as they're not coordinating with the individual. If they're going through a third party, is that a violation?
If it can be, yes. If there is evidence that the candidate is coordinating with the Independent Expenditure Committee through an intermediary, that can still be evidence. Now, again, this starts getting, very complicated.
I understand.
And city resources, I think very likely would not be in a position to really analyze and investigate this one. Possibly, if we got some sort of an outside attorney investigator who has experience with this, that's possible. But that becomes a very tricky factual issue. Was there coordination? Who knew what? Who was talking to who, et cetera?
I just want to know if that is a violation, if they're working through a third party and planning this out, that would be a violation. Not going into how do you enforce it, but I just want to make sure that is a violation. So that is a violation, correct?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. If a PAC is raising money specifically for an individual, did I hear you say that is allowed?
And again, I'm just getting a little terminological here. We're talking about PACs and super PACs. Super PAC is the name that they gave to independent expenditure committees. A PAC can be any political action committee. A candidate control committee is a PAC of some sort. So I tend to use the term super PAC to talk about the independent expenditure committees.
Super PAC.
If a super PAC is donating money directly to the candidate, it's subject to that contribution limit. On the other hand, if the super PAC is simply collecting contributions and expending that money for the benefit of the candidate without any direction from the candidate, or otherwise, that's considered free speech. We, the super PAC, feel that we want to support this one candidate, and they can do that. And they can accept contributions without limit. They can make expenditures without limit.
Correct. Okay, great. The other question I have about PACs, one of the things I've heard out there is that they could be, I don't know if it was Santa Cruz or somewhere nearby, they could be required to list their top contributors. Is that correct?
Under state, super PACs are required in their mailers, advertising, to disclose their top contributors. Now, under state law, top contributors are defined as those that contribute more than $50,000 to the super PAC. So if you're dealing with a very large one, there may be a very long list of, I'm so sorry, give me a second. There could be a very long list of top contributors as defined by state law. However, just requiring a super PAC to disclose their top 10 regardless of amount, that's something we would have to look into more carefully. If the super PAC is only getting contributions from 10 people at very low amounts, I'd have to look to see whether that might be considered an undue burden in putting it in their advertising because they're disclosing very small potential contributors. But we could certainly follow up on that if the council would like.
So let's just, so we're clear on this, if a super PAC does collect $50,000, that is required by state law to disclose that, as I understood it. Is that correct?
If they receive or from a single source, from a single funder, they have to disclose that. And it's like committee major funding by, and you've heard these on, video and, radio advertisements before. But again, the contributor has to have contributed 50,000 or more. It's not a 50,000 aggregate with the top 10 or something. It's very specific to those large contributors.
Okay. And that's not something like, for example, through a city ordinance can say your top 10, whether it's below 50,000. Have you seen that anywhere?
I have not, with I think one exception. I think it was Santa Cruz. But again, we could certainly look into that. We can see whether there is authority to do that or not. I don't, mean to be flip by saying this, but just because one city is doing it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the one size fits all for everyone else. Santa Cruz is a charter city. You are a general law city. That could also have some impact as well. But again, we could certainly look into that.
So I'm just curious on what they're doing out there. Again, I've heard a lot of communities are pushing back against PACs coming in to their areas. Stepping back to contributions, $250. Is there anything out there that limits, you've seen other communities limited to contributions from within the community itself, or is there state law that protects against that?
There would be no constitutional basis that I could see that would justify limiting contributions to those within the city. Contributions are considered a free speech right, and a numerical limit has been determined as a valid limit on free speech to prohibit, an appearance that, I paid so much money to this candidate that it looks like, that I bought the candidate, basically. But requiring a candidate or allow a candidate being able to go and get many different $250 contributions, both within and without the city, that's perfectly allowed. And I think there's a follow-on case to Citizens United, which addressed a slightly different issue, but I think the logic would hold that limiting it to just people with the city probably would not pass constitutional muster.
Great, thank you. Stepping back to the funding, if 50,000 or more were contributed to a PAC, we agree that that is currently state law, and it is a requirement, correct?
Yes, that is
And
correct.
it must be on all mailers or any, say,
And
for
they're
example,
advertising.
advertising. How about those when they're making phone calls for that PAC? Would that have to be disclosed at that time too?
Yeah, I would have to go back and look at the specific regs, but there are regs that have the specific wording for television ads, radio ads, social media, email, phone calls, all of that. There are for disclosures there. Again, if you depending on what your situation is, yes.
Okay, so that you have heard that then. Phone calls, people walking, door knocking,
Well,
or the PAC.
Again, I would have to go back and look at the specific regs specifically on phone calls. I know in print mails, in electronic mail, there are disclosures that have to go in there that talk about the top funders. Let me just refine my prior remark. I believe that there is that similar blurb on a phone call.
Okay.
But there are disclosure requirements in the written material, electronic material, radio, TV ads. Again, it's that, committee major funding from. You hear that, that clause at the end of these ads, and that's typically then where you'll have a list of top contributors.
So just so we're clear on this, again, I want to make sure those would have to be for $50,000 or more. So if there was 10, $50,000 or more contributors, they would have to list each one of those groups.
Yes, that's my understanding.
Funding sources. Would they list just the name or the city they come from? How does that work?
Again, we're getting into the real weeds of the regulations there, but the disclosures are typically the name of the contributor. With the very high level independent expenditure committees, they're with any of those top contributors, there's also websites on the Secretary of State's website that have those disclosures, things like that as well. So again, there's a series of disclosure requirements in there. Some in the advertising, some just have to have a very basic statement and then refer you to the website or something like that where there's more detailed information.
Great. Looking forward to getting that information as you get that. And I don't know if you want to handle this. I have a question about lobbyists within our own community. If this would be probably a separate issue, but maybe you would know the answer to it. Is it possible to restrict lobbying to the city from an exiting council member for a certain term, like 4 years? Is that something that can be done?
That one I could look into for the council if you'd like.
Okay, I'm curious about that. And I'm curious, is there a way, or is it possible to, and I'm sure this is probably already a law, to restrict lobbyists that have family members either elected or working from the city from lobbying the city directly? If you can look into that also, I'd appreciate that.
And so just so I'm clear again, this would be prohibiting a spouse, significant other of the outgoing or of a current elected official?
Or a lobbyist lobbying a city, our city, for an example, that happens to have a spouse or a relative, a close family relative, either working in the city or an elected official in the city. Is it possible to restrict lobbying from people that have extremely close ties into the city government daily functions?
We can certainly look into that, Mr. Mayor.
All right. Those are the questions I have. Is there any other questions from council members? Councilmember Burns, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Having heard the conversation, I want to go back to the other part of the ordinance besides the campaign contribution section. And so I actually brought this forward, and I brought it forward with the Belmont model. And so I think it'd be helpful to maybe reach out to Belmont, because Belmont's had a like ordinance absent the campaign contribution section that I'm aware of, to see how they've dealt with enforcing violations of it, and any other jurisdictions that may have developed a similar ordinance. And I would like to, Mr. Epperson, so just so I'm clear, any ordinance that is adopted by council that is violated, either it has penalty section to it, or then it resorts back to general penalties that is typically defined in the ordinance, correct? Or the municipal code, correct?
That's typically the case, yes.
Okay, and typically it's either gonna be a misdemeanor or an infraction, and typically, there are different triggers that would make it one versus the other, but if it were a misdemeanor, it would typically be sent to the local district attorney, and the DA could then either choose to pursue it or defer it back to the city attorney, am I correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, and so recognizing that, I don't think anybody wants this to end up being a misdemeanor. I really think all we're looking for is cooperation and compliance and people behaving, whether they be elected or appointed officials. Now, having said that, I've absolutely heard Vice Mayor Perez's concern about due process. And so where I would like to suggest that this goes, and this is really just for conversation and consideration of the council through development by staff, and I'd be willing to assist in this if it would be helpful. I would like it to be pursued as an administrative violation, where when a violation is identified, that it would either trigger a notice and order or a notice of violation. And typically in both of those, there's an opportunity to cure, and it could be anywhere from 48 hours. I've seen it from 48 hours to 30 days typically. And if you get compliance, then you're done. And often those are gonna be followed through either through fire inspectors or code enforcement inspectors, and often channeled through the city attorney. Having said that, I understand this creates a bit of a quandary if it's something, particularly if it involves one of the seated council members or somebody running for council, to put that onus and burden on the city attorney or the city clerk or the city manager, since all three of those people actually work for this city council. Having said that, what I would like to do is suggest to council for consideration that we absolutely hire a independent hearing officer that would be an attorney that would be in compliance with state law. And my understanding, to be a hearing officer in the state of California, you have to be a licensed attorney with a minimum of 5 years of practicing experience. Is that correct, Mr. Epperson?
That sounds correct, Councilmember Burns, but to be honest with you, I probably haven't looked at that in 5 or 6 years myself.
Okay. Okay. So whatever the law requires is where I'd like to see that head. And so then, in the event that there was an alleged violation, it could be referred to the hearing officer, and there would be a clearly defined due process, and that hearing officer then, as an attorney, could either choose to investigate it, but often attorneys have private investigators that work for them that could do that investigation, and then report back to council, and that way it would keep the city manager, the city clerk, and the city attorney out of this process. And I think it's a cleaner process. And then based on what the investigation revealed, a citation could be issued or not issued. And if it was issued, then there would be an appeal process for it. And even if the hearing officer upheld the citation, as I understand it, then there's a specific period of time that due process allows for that individual to then appeal that decision to the Superior Court. And so ultimately it still could end up in a court situation. But at least then, as the ordinance is created or crafted and created and then drafted and approved, those elements would be there, and it would be clear, it would be defined, and it would then give council a clear direction on what that process is, and it would depersonalize it, I believe. And I think that could be very helpful in that regard, as it relates to address the majority of the ordinance. And frankly, we're going to control a lot of this, whether we're appointed or elected officials, by our conduct. And as it relates to the campaign contributions, many, many questions that I believe need to be answered. Many have been asked, some have been answered, but it's kind of like opening Pandora's box as I see it. And the super PAC conversation is very interesting to me. It's very concerning, but my sense is that is enforced, any any alleged violations would be enforced either by the state of California or by the FPPC. Is that correct?
Not in this case, council member. First of all, before I get to answering that question, I wanted to echo your thoughts of this to an outside investigating attorney. That would be our recommendation as well, because as you've noted, it puts the city clerk's office, the city attorney's office in an awkward position to enforce, and putting that out to an independent investigating attorney who can take proper enforcement action definitely helps there to avoid, again, awkward, conflicted situations. Getting to your question about could we enforce these other things, I think the concern is if you are adopting different campaign contribution, different independent expenditure committee, different disclosure requirements than what the state does, you're going to be enforcing that on your own. I don't believe that the FPPC is going to necessarily enforce a local independent expenditure commission regulation that is different than state law. If they violated state law, if you had a super PAC that put out an advertisement that didn't have its top contributors on there, that's an independent violation of state law. They could come in and enforce that. But if the city council adopted an ordinance more restrictive, that would be on the city to enforce.
Thank you, I understand. And so I guess, again, though, if we had a defined process where a council member or a member of the community wanted to file a complaint, I believe we already have a process in place. If somebody wants to make a formal complaint against somebody, they can either do it through the city manager or the mayor, and in the mayor's absence, it becomes the vice mayor. And there's a clearly defined process that we could replicate in that regard. And then if we put it out to independent investigation, we would get down to, an independent decision, and we could make an educated decision based on the information that was provided. And so for me, it seems like there's a lot of ways that we could pick and choose to finalize what this is going to look like. And then the only real question in my mind after that is, do we have the budget capacity? And I think we do. And I think if we just earmark money in our next budget, and yeah, it's going to be, I don't know, do you pick $100,000, do you pick $1 million, or do you find somewhere in between? And you hope you don't have to have it, but then you don't have to chase it if you need it. And whether it be the mayor, the vice mayor, the mayor and the vice mayor, review these things and come up to some decision whether they warrant investigation or not. I think we can clearly define that process. And I think we're going to learn by our experience. We'll make some missteps, and then we can come back and adapt and adjust the ordinance, I presume, based on our experience. I mean, we've kind of found that was a challenge with the cannabis ordinance, and what the cannabis ordinance looked like several years ago versus what it should look like moving forward is all going to be changed as a direct result of council's and the city's experience. And I think this is kind of in that regard as well. And so I would, again, volunteer to help in this process, but I absolutely think it needs to be in an administrative process, and there are many examples of that out there to figure and use. And then I would suggest as council, maybe we look at whether it be Best and Krieger, or whether it be another recommendation from our city attorney to look for that independent hearing officer and law firm to do those type of investigations. I think time will prove how we need to adjust this, or if we need to. Thank you, everybody. Again, thank you for your presentation. It's very helpful. Mayor, that concludes my thoughts and comments. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Councilmember Burns. And I absolutely agree with your comments of the admin, especially rather. So very, very good comments. Do we have any other?
Mr. Mayor, if I may, just one last concluding comment here. I can certainly look into some potential referrals to an attorney investigator on this who could maybe provide, at least a thumbnail sketch of what a typical investigation may cost. Maybe give some options about what if the investigation ceases at the investigation and payment is made or disclosure is made, compliance is brought. or what might be, an additional cost if it gets pursued into court or some sort of an administrative process. So I can certainly bring that back to the council.
Thank you, sir. Was there any other comments or questions from council?
Yes.
Go ahead. Go ahead, ma'am.
So definitely the policy needs a lot of work. Obviously, there are sections that are referenced that are not anywhere, and those need to be addressed, and we may need to see what actually is included in that. But in addition to that, it speaks to two things. So campaign reform and actually the behavior of the council. So we talked a lot about the reform and somewhat about the conduct of the council. So some areas I'd like for the attorney to talk to us about, which is when staff actually violate election law, and what does that look like, and the responsibility of the council. Also, when city council members or mayor potentially violates FPPC rules and regulations, or when staff has misconduct in relations to election. And of course, the mention of due process. So even though people do reference the law, it is completely ignored. And then potential sanctions may be applied. And what does that look like in terms of the liability for the city of Hollister and implications? If you can touch on those, please.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned earlier, if a council member is accused of misconduct in conducting council meetings, things like that, then typically the solution is some sort of a reprimand, censure, removal from appointed committees, things like that. Misconduct in elections, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. If somebody has violated the elections code in some way, there are violations in the elections code that are misdemeanors, falsifying initiative petitions, things like that. There's a number of them. They're pretty serious. Again, not knowing the nature of the misconduct that you're talking about, it's a little hard to judge. Elections can be rough and tumble. Sometimes, what might be seen as misconduct is just part of the rough and tumble of politics. And sometimes it truly is something that rises to a level that may require legal investigation and possible enforcement. If the city council violates an established FPPC regulation, something that's codified in state law or state regulation, for example, conflict of interest, Government Code 1090, where you're not supposed to be interested in contracts with the city to a certain extent. Those things have their own sanctions in state law that can be pursued. And for example, a conflict of interest in a decision or Government Code 1090, that's separate from campaign finance reform. That's something that if there's a violation, the FPPC will in fact investigate and possibly enforce depending upon the facts. Your first question about what happens when staff doesn't follow the law, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that question.
Right, when there is election law and they for whatever reason decide not to follow it and do whatever they want to do. Well, I don't know of any situation like that.
If the elections code is not followed, there are remedies in the elections code. For example, if an election is say a ballot measure written incorrectly under the elections code or something like that, there are remedies where you can go to a court, get that corrected. If it's something that happened pre-election procedurally, usually those are challenged then. And if they're not, if the election was otherwise, properly conducted, then the election stands. So again, not knowing the nature of, what staff had done in under the elections code is a little hard to speculate there. But there are remedies in the elections code.
Okay, is that it?
I know you talked about due process a little bit and having the investigator. So if it's state FPPC rules or election law, there are criminal or civil charges that can be brought forth, correct?
If there is a serious enough violation of the Political Reform Act and FPPC regs, yes, there can be criminal enforcement. That is typically referred to the district attorney. I strongly advise clients not to have the city attorney or the city clerk engage particularly in criminal functions. That just puts everybody in a difficult, awkward, adversarial position. If an outside investigator is retained and finds that there are very serious violations, that could be referred to the district attorney, could be referred to the FPPC, if it's something besides just the contribution limits or the disclosures, your local ordinance. And yeah, I mean, they could pursue that up the chain. But criminal requires, in campaign finance and campaign disclosure, there's got to be some very, very serious stuff. Almost always it's dealt with fines and things like that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from council?
Mayor Velazquez?
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. I would like to also see a fine portion built into the ordinance, whether it be 100, 250, and 500. You pick whatever those numbers are consistent with the government code. I do believe the government code defines those. And because we are a general law city, I think we would be obligated to follow that direction. And then I guess I do have one follow-up question as well. I heard you say clearly we cannot restrict people from voting even if they've received campaign contributions. I understand that and it's clear. But I'm curious if we could require as a policy that prior to the vote be taken, that those council members or planning commissioners or Parks and Rec commissioners, whoever it may be that's taking a vote, be required to disclose that they had received financial contributions from those individuals. And so that, and I think we try and do that anyway, but I don't know that we do it consistently well. And so I was wondering if that could be part of a policy that would be something that could be enforced. I mean, anything could be a policy, but would it have enough teeth to require it? And if not, there'd be consequences. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Councilmember Burns. While the law does not allow for a mandatory recusal, I do believe that you could have an ordinance that requires disclosure prior to making a decision. Because again, disclosure is typically much easier to constitutionally justify than a hard limit.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor.
Is that it, Mr. Burns?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Resendez, go ahead, sir.
Thank you. And then might I add, Nova, you might want to take note of this to include that language in 2.04.015.12, representation of private interest. I think it talks a little bit about that, and that would be a good place to require the disclosure of any donations, it's assumed that we're supposed to have disclosing the talks. I think we addressed that. And then the amount that was donated throughout the entire term of the council person, if that's okay with the council.
Right. If there are no other comments or questions from council, we will.
I have one last one.
Go ahead, sir.
So-
Go ahead, Vice Mayor.
So, thank you. Threw me off. So what's the $250 campaign contribution limit? So how do any other cities, I'm going to try to word this right, forgive my layman terms. So how does that affect a person that loans themselves $50,000 compared to someone? I mean, is there limits on what you can loan yourself?
a candidate cannot be limited in utilizing their own money.
Now, are we able to set policy to that? Because someone that is more financial, has more money than someone that doesn't, and it seems like it's an unfair policy to be enacted that way. It just doesn't make sense to me that way.
Well, I understand.
That could just be
the
politics
sentiment.
too.
Yes, I understand the sentiment, and I understand that there is a very strong desire on the part of many public officials to really, in the interest of fairness, try to get as much money out of politics and try to equalize, political opportunities as much as possible. The problem is the Supreme Court disagrees with you. And the Supreme Court has held that a candidate that is not limited in the spending of his or her own money.
But that is
So they can self-finance without limit. On the other hand, getting contributions from others, that's where the limits can come in. We got into a lot of this discussion with Citizens United. That decision, we're talking about independent expenditure committees and all that. And, the court went into a pretty big discussion about how, again, direct contributions are really the concern. Contributions of one's own money, you have that money anyway. And the fact that there are people of more means than others is not a constitutional justification to set those types of limits. So that's what the Supreme Court has said.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
More of a comment, Mr. Mayor.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. So as the mayor alluded to earlier, that this is a major push for campaign finance reform happening because of all the issues that have been going on. Some of the things that are positives is that it creates greater racial and class diversity among donors, increased number of low dollar donors and constituent participation. You have more quality time with the average constituents, and better policies come out as a result. Not many politicians that I know of are self-funding their campaigns or do self-fund their campaign. If they did, I would see that they've got a vested interest in what they're doing. I would see it as a plus, that they're actually taking their own money. And I know that somebody sitting up there now did in fact do that because they really care about it. But most people don't do that. And that's why we're addressing the problem, because it has been a problem where people are handpicked to be up there to represent special interests, and it becomes a conflict of financial interest. So that's why we're talking about it. And I just wanted to end on that note. I'm very excited and very pleased with the policy that my colleagues have came up with, and I thank you all. That's it, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, sir. At this time, we'll go ahead and open to the public. If there's any speaker cards.
I have no speaker cards, and no one has their hand raised on Zoom.
Thank you. Well, tonight was just a discussion, so there's no voting on any of these issues. So I want to thank everyone, Mr. Priest, for being here tonight and answering many of these questions we all had concerns about, and everyone else that participated tonight with their comments and questions. So thank you very much to everyone. Again, I'm going to stress COVID, please protect yourselves out there. It is spreading rapidly throughout the state, our community, and the country. So please take care, everyone. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
There is a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
There is a motion and a second. Roll call vote, please.
Vice Mayor Perez,
Yes.
Councilmember Resendez,
Yes.
Councilmember Morales,
Yes.
Councilmember Burns,
Yes.
Mayor Velasquez.
Yes.
It's a unanimous vote.
Thank you very much. And good night, everyone.
Recording stopped.